The cameras were rolling, the audience was silent, and then Dr. Phil did something no one expected. He raised his hand toward the control room, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Stop the tape!" The studio froze. Every producer, every camera operator, every audience member held their breath. In the guest chair, 73-year-old Margaret Wallace's hands trembled as she covered her face. This wasn't supposed to happen. Not like this. Not now. But Dr. Phil had just heard something that changed everything. He stood up, walked past the cameras, and headed straight toward the back of the stage. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low but firm. "Off camera, right now." What had just been confessed in front of millions would unravel a family secret that had been buried for 50 years. A fortune, a lie, and 3 generations caught in the wreckage. This is the story of how one grandmother's admission on the Dr. Phil show exposed a mystery so deep it would force an entire family to confront the truth they'd been running from their whole lives. 3 weeks earlier, the Wallace family had received the call. A producer from the Dr. Phil show wanted to talk. They'd seen the family story online, a viral post about a bitter inheritance dispute that had torn siblings apart and left a grandmother in the middle, heartbroken and silent. The post had been written by Rachel Wallace, 38, the middle child, who claimed her older brother had manipulated their late father's will to cut her and her younger sister out of a multi-million-dollar estate. Rachel believed their grandmother Margaret held the key to the truth, but Margaret had refused to speak about it for 2 years. Now Dr. Phil wanted to bring them all together on national television to finally get answers. Rachel agreed immediately. Her older brother, David, 42, refused at first, but eventually gave in after their lawyer advised him it might help his case. Their younger sister, Na, 34, was hesitant but desperate for closure. And Margaret, the matriarch who had watched her grandchildren destroy each other over money she never wanted them to fight about, finally said yes. She was tired of the secrets, tired of the silence. The taping was scheduled for a Thursday morning in Los Angeles. The family arrived separately. They hadn't spoken in over a year. But what none of them knew was that Dr. Phil had already done his homework, and he had obtained a document that would change everything. The show began like any other episode. Dr. Phil walked onto the stage to applause, his expression serious but composed. He introduced the case. The family feuded over a fortune that was supposed to bring security but had instead brought devastation. The audience leaned in as the first segment rolled, a pre-taped package showing Rachel's tearful account of how her brother had allegedly forged documents, manipulated their ailing father, and stolen what was rightfully theirs. Then came David's rebuttal, cold, calculated, defensive. He claimed Rachel and Nina had abandoned their father in his final years, that he had been the only one who cared, and that the will reflected their father's true wishes. The sisters, he said, were motivated by greed, not grief. The audience murmured. Dr. Phil listened without interruption, his eyes moving between the siblings like a judge studying evidence. And then he turned to Margaret. She sat in the center chair, small and fragile, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She wore a pale blue cardigan and a string of pearls, the same one she'd worn to her husband's funeral 30 years earlier. Her eyes were red, but she hadn't cried yet. She was holding it together, barely. "Margaret," Dr. Phil said, gently, leaning forward, "you've been quiet through all of this. You've watched your grandchildren go to war over money. You've seen lawyers, court battles, accusations, but you haven't said a word. Why?" Margaret's lips trembled. She looked down at her hands. "Because I was afraid." "Afraid of what?" She didn't answer right away. The studio was so quiet you could hear the hum of the cameras, and then she said it. "Afraid they would find out the truth." Dr. Phil paused. The audience shifted in their seats. Rachel and Nina exchanged glances. David's face tightened. "What truth, Margaret?" Dr. Phil asked, his voice softer now, but insistent. Margaret closed her eyes, her shoulders shook, and when she opened her mouth again, the words came out broken like glass shattering on concrete. "The money," she said, "it was never your grandfather's." Subscribe and leave a comment because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. The silence that followed was suffocating. Dr. Phil didn't move. He didn't interrupt. He let the weight of her words settle over the room like a fog. Rachel's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Na's hands gripped the armrests of her chair. David stood frozen, his face pale. "What do you mean it was never his?" Dr. Phil asked, his tone measured, careful. Margaret's voice was barely audible now. "It was mine." She looked up, tears streaming down her face. "I inherited it from my father when I was 23 years old. Your grandfather, he never had any money. We were broke when we got married, but I had this inheritance and I gave it to him. I put it in his name because back then that's what women did. We didn't have our own accounts. We didn't have our own anything. So I gave it to him, and he invested it, built it up, and everyone thought it was his money, his success. But it wasn't. It was mine. It was always mine." The revelation hung in the air like a bomb that had just detonated. The audience gasped. Rachel covered her mouth with her hand. Na started crying. David shook his head, disbelief written all over his face. "So, when your husband passed away," Dr. Phil said, "and the will was executed, that fortune, the one your grandchildren are fighting over, it was actually your money, not his." Margaret nodded, her face buried in her hands. Dr. Phil turned to the siblings. "Do any of you have any idea what this means?" Rachel was the first to speak, her voice shaking. It means the will. It doesn't even matter because it wasn't his to give away." David's voice came out sharp, defensive. "That's not how estate law works. Once it's in his name—" "Stop," Dr. Phil said firmly, raising his hand. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the noise like a judge's gavel. "Just stop." He walked back to Margaret and crouched down beside her chair, his voice dropping to a tone only she and the microphones could hear. "Margaret," Dr. Phil said, "why didn't you ever say anything? Why did you let this go on for so long?" She looked at him with eyes full of a pain that had been accumulating for decades. "Because I was afraid they would think their grandfather was a fraud. I didn't want to ruin his memory. He was a good man. He just took credit for something that wasn't his, and I let him because I loved him, and because back then that's what you did." Dr. Phil paused mid-sentence. The studio went completely silent. He stood up slowly, turned to the control room, and did something no one in that studio had ever seen him do before.
He walked off the stage, past the cameras, past the lights, straight to the production booth. The audience sat in stunned silence. The siblings didn't move. Margaret sobbed quietly in her chair. 2 minutes later, Dr. Phil returned. In his hand was a manila envelope, weathered and yellowed with age. He walked back to the center of the stage and held it up. "This," he said, his voice steady and deliberate, "is a copy of your grandmother's original inheritance document from 1971. It shows that the money, the estate, the fortune you've been fighting over was legally transferred from her father to her, not to your grandfather, to her." He placed the envelope on the table in front of Margaret. She never gave up her legal claim. She just never enforced it. The camera zoomed in on the envelope. The audience leaned forward. Rachel, Nina, and David stared at it like it was a ghost. Dr. Phil turned to the siblings. "So here's the reality. The money you've been tearing each other apart over, it doesn't belong to any of you. Not legally, not morally. It belongs to her." He pointed to Margaret. "And she's been sitting here watching you destroy each other because she loves you too much to tell you the truth. She'd rather lose the money than lose you." Nina started sobbing. Rachel buried her face in her hands.
David sat down heavily, his head in his hands. Dr. Phil walked over to Margaret and knelt beside her again. "You don't owe them anything, Margaret. You know that, right?" She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "But I know you," Dr. Phil continued, "and I know you're not here to take it back. You're here because you want them to stop hurting each other, aren't you?" She nodded again. Dr. Phil stood and addressed the entire family. "Then here's what's going to happen. Off camera, you're all going to sit down with a mediator I'm providing. You're going to work this out, not in court, not through lawyers, but as a family, because that's what she deserves." He turned to the audience. "And if you're watching this, and you've been in a fight with your family over money, over pride, over who's right and who's wrong, I want you to ask yourself one question. Is it worth it? Is it worth losing the people who love you?" Off camera, Dr. Phil made a choice no producer expected. After the taping ended, Dr. Phil didn't leave. He stayed. He brought Margaret, Rachel, Nina, and David into a private room backstage. No cameras, no audience, just them, a mediator, and the truth. For 3 hours, they talked. They cried. They confronted 50 years of silence, resentment, and misunderstanding. Margaret told them stories they'd never heard, about the sacrifices she'd made, the choices she'd been forced into, the love she'd carried, even when it wasn't returned. And slowly, something shifted. The anger didn't disappear, but it softened. The siblings began to see each other not as enemies, but as people who had all been hurt by the same system, the same secrets, the same silence. By the end of the session, they agreed to divide the estate equally, with Margaret retaining full control over her portion. They agreed to attend family therapy, and most importantly, they agreed to start talking again. Dr. Phil stood by the door, watching it all unfold. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. His job wasn't to solve their problems. It was to give them the space and the courage to solve it themselves. As they left the studio that day, Margaret hugged each of her grandchildren. She held them tightly the way she used to when they were children, and for the first time in 2 years, they hugged her back. But what happened next is something no one in the room or watching at home saw coming. 3 months later, Rachel sent Dr. Phil a letter. In it, she included a photo. It was taken at Thanksgiving. The whole family was there,